Jack Shepherd takes BBC Two's last acting masterclass in 45 minutes, trying to bring a personal touch to Shakespeare's soliloquies. Now BBC Two has Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman.
After 5 days' bombardment, the international community finally takes steps to bring Israel's attack on Lebanon to an end. Has the West been a quiet accomplice to the killing? Good evening. In half an hour's time, the United Nations Security Council is to discuss the Israeli attack on Lebanon. The Lebanese ambassador there would like it to demand an immediate withdrawal. Fat chance if the United States doesn't agree. The Israelis say they want the Syrians and their vassal state Lebanon to understand that they have to control the Hezbollah guerrillas which keep murdering Israelis. Have the British and Americans actually been going along with them because they share that objective? We'll be talking about what the different parties are really after, with contributions from Jerusalem, Washington and London. Claire Short makes the mistake of speaking her mind and discovers that New Labour means new gagging orders.
Could you tell us about what happened on the tax?
No, thank you.
The last time they had power in Italy, it was Mussolini who gave it to them. Are the fascists making a comeback under this man? And can you have democratic fascism? And the new literary prize for books written by women and judged by women. As one of the judges condemns some of the entries as drivel, was it inevitable if you have a prize from which you ban the work of half the population? The writer Sarah Dinant defends the prize against the Sunday Telegraph's literary editor Miriam Gross. The Israeli Air Force flew 220 sorties in Lebanon today. Given the amount of high explosive involved, the number of people reported dead so far is perhaps surprisingly small. 27 Lebanese. One Israeli soldier is also reported killed. All the Lebanese dead were civilians, some children. The rest of the world, meaning in this case the United States as the only power whose approval Israel worries about, is said to be knocking together a proposal to try to end the fighting. But there is little sign of urgency about it, as if they want Israel to finish sending her message to the Syrians and to her own electorate. Mark Urban reports.
For the fifth day, Israeli artillery and aircraft have pounded southern Lebanon. Most of the people have fled. The shells and bombs are battering ghost towns. But they're sending a message, and since yesterday, they've been making it more emphatic. Power plants and other economic targets have been hit. Israel's way of telling Lebanon it must curb the Hezbollah guerrillas in its midst. However miserable the lot of Lebanese refugees, the United States, supported by Britain, has been robust in defense of Israel. They've allowed Prime Minister Shimon Peres a great deal of latitude in a military campaign which seems closely linked to his forthcoming electoral one. Now, though, Washington has started the process of brokering a ceasefire that will allow Mr. Peres to stop the bombardment. This morning, Lebanese army units raced up and down Beirut's Corniche, demonstrating their impotence, firing machine guns at jets soaring out of range above. Israel controls the skies, and Syria much of what happens on the ground. Yesterday, the man who runs the Lebanese government began trying to ease the vice-like grip of his neighbours. Rafik Hariri, the Prime Minister, went to Damascus to ask Syria's President Hafiz Assad for help.
If Hariri, for whatever reason, feels that Israeli action or Hezbollah actions are putting him under extreme pressure that he can't take, he can appeal to Assad to relieve some of that pressure. But it's very much a matter of appealing to a patron, not trying to put pressure on a client.
By the time he arrived in Paris today for talks with President Chirac, Mr. Hariri was ready with an agreed Lebanese-Syrian line. He offered Israel a return to the deal made in July 1993, which ended Israel's last major expedition in Lebanon. Hezbollah itself also endorses this approach, as an important member of the group NEWSNIGHT contacted this evening, but who insisted on anonymity, explained.
We are not going to violate the agreement of July 1993. The Israelis did start violating this agreement. And what we are doing, we are only retaliating. We are only shelling back the attackers. They attacked our people, our civilians, and that's why we retaliate.
The past week's fighting has happened because both sides abandoned that 1993 understanding. Syria agreed last time because it was a secret pact which it didn't have to enforce. There are limits to their willingness to strong-arm the guerrillas, as was explained to a British MP just back from Damascus.
The Syrians really could stop Hezbollah if they wanted to, but they don't want to, or at least didn't want to on Friday, because they liken the Hezbollah to the French resistance. They say they have a legal right to use force. But I put it to them that perhaps it wasn't wise to exercise that right at the moment, because unlike the case with the French resistance, there's no chance of throwing Israel out by force. What they need is a negotiated settlement, and violence is simply putting back the day when a negotiated settlement will be reached.
We don't need a
Shimon Peres was this morning schmoozing some Japanese visitors, doing his best to look and sound like a man in no hurry to conclude deals.
Well, it's too early to negotiate.
It appears he had in fact already entered secret discussions with the Americans, but the question tonight is, what are his objectives? Hezbollah rockets fell on northern Israel again this morning. More people had to be evacuated to safety. A deal which stops this happening will clearly meet an important Israeli objective. But since Mr. Peres hasn't taken up Lebanon's offer for just such an arrangement today, it's apparent that he wants more. A good result for the Prime Minister is one which sinks Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of the right-wing Likud party, who today visited troops as part of his campaign for the general elections. Peres, the Americans, even Syria and Hezbollah itself would prefer not to deal with Likud.
He will deal by whatever paths he chooses with whoever is the Prime Minister of Israel. That it's not his business who they choose. Behind that public statement, I'm sure he would recognize that with a Labour alignment government and with Peres, there is probably more hope of flexibility than there would be if the other result took place. But he won't pay a price for it.
The last thing most Israelis want is a deeper involvement in Lebanon. Instead, and one Israeli TV channel is tonight suggesting this is what will happen, Mr. Peres may seek an arrangement which stops the rocketing in the short term and leads to a full-phased withdrawal from southern Lebanon, allowing Syria to complete its military domination of its neighbour while preventing further attacks on Israel. Grand designs like that will take time, and there's a risk that any Israeli desire for more comprehensive agreements could be pushing the Syrians too far, too fast.
Well, in a few minutes, the United Nations Security Council will discuss a protest from the Lebanese government against the Israeli action. I'm joined on the telephone now from New York by our UN correspondent, Rob Watson. Rob Watson, do you know what the British position is going to be to start off with?
Well, the British position is different to what it normally is, which is normally fairly neutral when it comes to conflicts between Israel and the Arab world. Britain is backing the Israeli attacks. It's saying that it's a legitimate response to a terrorist attack, and sources tell me that Downing Street has been quite firmly involved in this, and its argument is that, well, if Britain wants to take tough measures against the IRA, it would be hypocritical to criticise Israel.
Well, in those circumstances, given that that attitude is probably shared by the United States, there's precious little chance of a condemnation issuing in a resolution, is there?
I would have thought there was zero chance. The United States has made it clear, the US officials have made it clear to me that they will block any kind of legally binding action by the UN, and that essentially this debate will just be a chance for a great deal of hot air to be let off, a great deal of anger from the Arab nations that will take part in it, but little more than that.
Rob Watson, thank you very much. Well, in the studio now is Cyril Townsend, who's director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. Uri Dromi, the Israeli government spokesman, joins us from Jerusalem, and Geoffrey Kemp, formerly of the National Security Council, now of the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom, joins us from Washington. Uri Dromi, first of all, what is required to end this operation in Lebanon?
Well, quite obviously, what is required is that the Hezbollah will stop launching Katyushas on our cities in the north, and later a new situation should emerge that will enable our people in the north to live quietly. That's all. We made it clear. This is what we need. If we achieve that, we stop the fighting.
But you heard that Hezbollah spokesman in that report, I hope, saying that they were quite prepared to go back to the 1993 agreement.
You know, I haven't heard so much nonsense recently in television. After exhausting all our patience and after trying and leaving no stone unturned in trying to find a diplomatic way to calm down the situation, we were forced by the terroristic launching of Katyushas by the Hezbollah to take this defensive act. I hope that the Hezbollah, and even more so the Lebanese government, will understand that we are serious in our attempt to secure our people in the north and to restore the calm here.
Right. Jeffrey Kemp in Washington. Warren Christopher is said to have been on the telephone making preliminary steps to try to resolve this. How do you think he's going to do it?
Well, I think that this will be resolved fairly soon, unless the Katyushkas continue, or alternatively, unless the Syrians decide to get involved directly, which I don't think they will. I think, to be blunt about it, Washington is not displeased with what's happening in Lebanon. This is probably going to help Shimon Peres, and like it or not, the Clinton administration privately is very anxious for Shimon Peres to be elected on May the 29th as prime minister in his own right, so that the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations can continue. And that, of course, is the key to it. We don't want anything to happen to destroy that peace process. To that extent, Lebanon's a sideshow.
Right. Cyril Townsend, you have just come from a function with the Syrians here in London. What do you think the Syrians would agree to?
The Syrians, like the Lebanese, think that Israel should withdraw from occupying 10% of an independent sovereign country and a fellow member of the United Nations. And until that happens, we're not going to have peace in the Lebanon. That's for starters. Secondly, this is not defense by Israel. We heard about the incident when an ambulance was hit the other day. We learned today that power stations and electrical installations near Beirut are being taken out. This is not war against a terrorist movement. This, frankly, is punishing the Lebanon. It's got to stop.
Right, but let's just clear that point up first, Uri Dremi. What is the point of hitting power stations, for example, and I take it they were innocent casualties, the children who were murdered?
First of all, I want to take issue with what the gentleman just said and refer to what one of your correspondents said before, that taking the volume of the fighting, it's surprising that so few people were hurt. Well, we regret the loss of life of any one individual, but the fact that only 27 people reported wounded or hurt shows that we are going out of our way to not to hit civilians, not to hit innocent people. The purpose of hitting a power station or power grid is simple. There's no way in which only we will be at the receiving end of Katyushas and of rocketing, and power will fail in Kiryat Shmona because of bombings, and children will be evacuated, and people will live in shelters, and people in Lebanon will enjoy the immunity. There's no way to have this, to let this happen.
So it's retaliation against Lebanese people for attacks carried out by a terrorist group?
No, it's really trying to go after the Hezbollah and after the terrorists, and even right. This terrible incident of this ambulance, which we regret, was an exception and not the rule, and we go out of our way to make sure that civilians are not hurt there.
Right. Jeffrey Kemp, civilians are being killed, 27 or more that we know about. It is an act of extraordinary cynicism, isn't it, on the part of the American government to allow that to happen in order, as you put it, that the man they choose can be returned as Prime Minister?
Well, I think that's not exactly what I said. I think that the Israelis have an absolute right to defend themselves. That is accepted in Washington and I guess in London. And the fact of the matter is that the American position is that the Hezbollah started this confrontation and that Syria has the capacity to stop it. Now, of course, it's tragic that people were killed. But remember, when there were horrible terrorist attacks on Israel in March, there was not a peep out of Damascus and very little sympathy out of Lebanon. So while it's tragic what's happening and while everyone hopes it soon stops, I don't think to say this is cynical is quite the right phrase.
What do you imagine the Americans would like to see the Syrians doing?
I don't think they believe the Syrians are really going to do very much at this point in time. Clearly not escalate the conflict. Clearly help broker some deal that gets them back to the 1993 proposals, because that suits everybody. But let's be very honest about it. Nothing is going to happen on the Syrian-Israeli front, or for that matter on the Israeli-Lebanese front diplomatically, until after May the 29th, when we see who's the Prime Minister of Israel.
Who do you imagine that President Assad would like to see as the Israeli Prime Minister, Cyril Townsend?
He's not choosing Israeli prime ministers, but no doubt he would prefer the present one. What he's insisting on, quite rightly, is we should get back to international law, that Israel should not occupy the Golan Heights against international law. Israel should not occupy a part of Lebanon against international law, and certainly it shouldn't be bombing Lebanese villages and threatening to bomb any vehicle that goes back towards those villages in another country. This is intolerable international behavior. Israel is behaving like a rogue elephant in the Middle East, and it's time it was brought to order.
How do you imagine that's going to happen?
By, I hope, the European Union taking a slightly stronger line it has, and already signs that the French president is detaching himself from the American position, and I'm looking for a stronger stance from London too.
Well, London has been thoroughly behind Israel.
That I would doubt. I think there has been a distance between Britain and the United States. And I think you'll find that public opinion in this country is swinging pretty fast against what Israel has been up to for the last 5 days in Lebanon.
Uri Jeremy, I know you can't give us a military assessment of how long this will go on, but what's your rough guess? Are we looking at something that's going to drag on right until we get to elections?
First of all, I'm not so impressed with all this reference to elections. We are here doing something which we were forced to do by the Hezbollah in order to defend our people. And the Israeli public now is leaving aside the politics and is really interested in restoring calm in the north of Israel.
Okay.
Now,
thank you all
how
very
long
much.
it will take? It will take as long as necessary.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you. Claire Short, Labour's transport spokesman, has had a trying day. According to the script written by the men in Labour's Mission Control, today was to have been her chance to shoot holes in the government scheme to sell off the railway tracks. But yesterday she made the mistake of speaking her mind in response to Tony Blair's reassurances to people on middle-class incomes on the subject of taxation. As someone on a middle-class income herself, she thinks she ought to pay a bit more. Speaking your mind is a dangerous thing to do in New Labour, and the men in suits came down on her for it, whispering anonymously to journalists that she was unprofessional. Mark Mardell spent the day trying to find her.
I started the day with a question. Where's Claire? Hello, is Claire Short there, please? It should have been her big day, the star of a dozen interviews about rail privatisation. But she wasn't on the TV news. Her deputy got the job instead. She wasn't on The World at 1. The word had gone out from Labour's high command that any interview today would be ruined by awkward questions. She'd been disappeared after a sin on Sunday.
I think in a fair tax system, people like me would pay a bit more tax. But I don't
For breaking Labour's omerta, the code of silence on taxation, the spin doctors labelled her unprofessional and clumsy. She compounded the sin by going on the attack on radio this morning.
It's like a conspiracy to stop politicians talking honestly. So you get robots who just clone what they're told to say out of press releases. And someone like me, who says what I really think, is supposed to be quiet and not speak the truth. And I will not be silenced.
Claire Short said her position on tax had been misrepresented because while journalists had assumed she only got the MP's salary of £34,085, they'd missed the fact she also got a widow's pension. Her husband was an MP, so that gave her an extra £4,549, although it could be slightly more as he was briefly a junior minister. She said she also earned fees from the media, but few organisations pay front benchers, so it would be unlikely she'd earn more than £1,000 at the most. That adds up to just under 40,000, but whatever the figure, New Labour doesn't like talk about where a top rate would bite.
What I said was that we don't need more taxation in Britain. And then I said, as a personal remark, and I think politicians should have a moral attitude to politics and not just preach to others, that people like me could afford to pay a bit more tax.
After that, someone decided no more interviews. Even so, a news conference was dominated by the subject of the absent Ms. Short. John Prescott, a veteran of run-ins with the spin doctors, was there playing poacher turned gamekeeper.
I think every one of us in the Shadow Cabinet likes to speak their mind on occasions. I haven't been known to do it myself. But there is a Shadow Cabinet responsibility, and all of us have to take that into account.
Off-the-record briefings by enforcers like Tony Blair's formidable press secretary, Alistair Campbell, make even senior Labour politicians spit in private. They, in turn, don't like being caught at it. But not even the doctors of spin could completely deny Mrs. Short to her public. We tracked her down to a BBC cubbyhole, doing an interview for Radio Wales. Scotland, Ireland, England were denied further elucidation.
No, I don't want to talk to you, thank you.
Could you tell us about what happened on the tax?
No, thank you.
Here at Labour's media headquarters, the word is this is just the small change of politics, a one-day wonder that will make no impact on the public at all. But behind that hope, there's real irritation at Claire Short's undoubted ability to grab bad headlines for Labour by refusing to use the weasel words and formulas of New Labour. One party source, asked if Tony Blair would be ticking her off, said it was more a matter of self-bollocking. But many Labour MPs think she shouldn't have to undergo that painful and probably physically impossible process.
I earn the MP's salary, which is £34,000. I should pay more in taxation to deal with the social problems that exist in this country, and I would be prepared to pay more in taxation.
Would you?
Yes, if I thought it was going into the NHS and in education, yes, I would be in favour of that.
But this is the sort of stuff that makes the other parties gloat.
Claire Short thinks she should pay higher taxes. She's a middle-class income earner. That means that she wants middle-class England to pay higher taxes.
What I think it does tell us is that there's a tremendous degree of frustration building up within the Parliamentary Labour Party about the inexactitude of their policy, the lack of clarity.
Claire Short has hit the headlines before for talking about pornography, for talking about drugs, but her undoing might be breaching the final taboo, talking about higher tax in front of the voters.
Mark Mardell, we did ask Ms. Short to appear live on tonight's programme, but she declined. She's probably trying to find out how to administer that exercise to herself. The Italians go through the familiar exercise of voting in a general election later this week. Since the war, Italy has had more governments than it's had Easters, but this, the third election in 4 years, finds an unprecedented number of people despairing of a choice between a flea and a louse. Into the vacuum has stepped Gianfranco Fini's right-wing, self-styled post-fascist party, the National Alliance. Latest opinion polls have them set to win 25% of the vote. Our correspondent Matt Fry followed Mr. Fini's election campaign to Sicily, the heart of his power base in Italy's south.
The maidens of the party are poised. The stage is set for the leader. The piazza is packed with the faithful. It's showtime once again.
La speranza del futuro dei giovani.
Fini and his party are the only hope for the young in this country, just as they were 30 years ago.
Per me, credo per tantissimi italiani, per tantissimi giovani.
For me, for many Italians, he's mythical. He's the man of the future.
Meet Gianfranco Fini if you can get close enough. Mobbed like a pop star, he is the president of the National Alliance and today Italy's most popular politician. The spiritual heirs of Mussolini, he and his party have been resurrected from the dustbin of history to lead the Italian right. Mr. Fini has every reason to be confident. Unlike his closest ally, Silvio Berlusconi, he's neither on trial nor under investigation. Quite a feat these days. Fini has become the squeaky clean saint of the right.
Quando in alcune
He preaches the moral renewal of the Italian nation, a message tailor-made for his power base here in Italy's depressed south. Fini is playing the part of the man of providence while trying not to conjure up the ghosts of the fascist past.
Noi siamo di destra, ma esiste una destra democratica.
We are of the right, but the democratic right, which in Italy didn't exist before, or if it did exist, wasn't recognized as such. We can be right without being tied to fascism.
Noi possiamo guardare con un sovrano disprezzo.
Benito Mussolini, the greatest statesman of this century. That's according to Gianfranco Fini, who paid him the compliment only 2 years ago. In 1945, the Duce was lynched 7 years before Fini was even born. The Italian bandwagon had turned against fascism. There was only one party that dared to preserve Mussolini's legacy, the Italian social movement, the MSI, Fini's party. In 1987, Giorgio Almirante, the party's founder, died. Fini took over. His task was to inject young blood into a dying party. The torch of fascism was in good hands, he reassured the rank and file, in young, strong hands. The purifying waters of Fuji, a spa south of Rome, famous for curing gout. But could it also turn fascists into conservatives? Last year, Fini summoned the faithful here to engineer the conversion of the neo-fascist party before the skeptical eyes of the world. For the first time ever, his ministers had sat in government, and with power came the need for respectability. In a baptism of laser, the party was reborn with a new name and a new manifesto. Mussolini was spirited away. The National Alliance has come out of the closet, flexing its electoral muscles. Especially in cities like Messina, the movement has inherited millions of voters from the Christian Democrats, the corrupt and now defunct ruling party. Mr. Fini appeals to the petit bourgeoisie, families like the Coppolas, who feel squeezed by the recession and humiliated by Italy's brash, rich north. In Fini, they have found a patron. The party has dished up a schizophrenic mixture of left-wing economics and right-wing social values, appealing in these uncertain times. Gaspare Coppola works for the Italian state railways, and his expectations are about as vague as dreaming of trains running on time again.
If Fini wins, we, his supporters, can continue to be honest, hard-working citizens. I'll be able to support my wife and children, and we'll have a fair and not an arrogant leader.
The campaign has been littered with vague promises, and the electors are losing faith in the system. The time is ripe for Mr. Fini to try and rewrite the rules. With much of the south and large parts of the rest of the country already behind him, Gianfranco Fini now wants to take Rome by storm. But he doesn't just want to be another prime minister of another brittle ruling coalition. He wants to reshape the country's political landscape. He wants Italy to be run by a president directly elected by the people. It looks as if Rome is on the verge of another historic political experiment. In the land of isms, they call this magic cure presidentialism.
Presidentialism will finally give us the guarantee that we will have a stable government for at least 5 years. The evil of this democracy is that no government has lasted more than 11 months at the most. We must have stability to govern.
With radical change, the domain of the right, the champagne-drinking classes have flocked to their former enemies. Once feared as the Red Peril, the Democratic Party of the left has become the voice of conservatism. In a campaign which has seen actors, tycoons and footballers paraded as candidates, almost anything goes, even a foreign correspondent. Spanish by birth, Tana de Zulueta used to be the Economist's woman in Rome. Now her mission is to battle Mr. Fini's revolution.
If one actually asks Mr. Fini to explain in some detail what he means by a French-style presidency, it doesn't seem to have that much to do with France, and it has rather a lot to do with a notion which is rather old in this country, and that is of a man alone in command, which is what Mussolini used to say. Fini says, I would like the head of government or the head of state directly elected by the people, naturally without reforming the media, and in opposition to Parliament. Now that doesn't seem to me like a recipe for either efficient or peaceful or indeed very democratic government.
The left has summoned the hounds of history in its campaign to unmask Mr. Fini's real motives. A partisan during the war, Giuseppe Zelli still remembers the rise of fascism. The makeup of the right may have changed, he says, but not its soul.
The rise of Mr. Fini and his party reminds me clearly of the rise of fascism and Mussolini in the 1920s, especially in their violent rhetoric and the way in which both are trying to get to power. In fact, I think it's this hunger for power that worries me the most.
Mr. Fini's fresh-faced foot soldiers have no such qualms. After all, their only encounter with the fiasco of fascism is a cursory glance at the history books. Blissfully unburdened by the past and brought up on democratic manners, they are the party's greatest asset. And this is their masticating mentor. Francesco Storace is still grappling with the party's new etiquette. One of Fini's closest advisors and his former spokesman, he would almost certainly be a minister in a right-wing government. People like him are Fini's biggest problem. He makes no bones about the party's past.
We have sacrificed something of our identity for the sake of moderation, but not everything, of course. The values are the same. Only the superficial aspects have gone, like the party's nostalgia for the past. And that, anyway, was being used as propaganda against us.
In the late 1970s, Mr. Storace was still pinning up posters of the Duce. When he was elected to Parliament in 1994, he picked a fight in the chamber. There's nothing unsettling about the manifesto of today's National Alliance, but sometimes actions do speak louder than words.
Non è che dopo averli traditi non ti fidi più nemmeno degli operai! Non è che non ti fidi più nemmeno del lavoro dipendente!
And the words are boiling with rage. At this rally in a Rome working-class district, Storace articulated the party's most winning message: discontent with just about everything, from Italy's inefficient health service to a rotten political system. With only a short stint in power, the National Alliance has been spared the temptations of corruption. It can point the finger, but in the light of its past, today's rage is unsettling. There's no doubt that Mr. Fini himself comes across as a very reasonable man.
I eat with a knife and fork. I don't wipe my mouth on the curtains.
But I put it to him that the rank and file often left a less civilized impression.
Ma cambia con il tempo. Certo, bisogna stare attenti.
It will change. It will change with time. Of course, we must be careful when someone hasn't understood the change. But one can't consider them all as authoritarian, as you say. This is a slow process that continues day by day. Nobody today doubts the sincerity of the change. One must always be careful to distinguish reality from appearances.
Distinguere ciò che è reale da ciò che appare.
At home with Prince Sforza Ruspoli, otherwise known as the Black Prince, once the wrinkled conscience of the party. A founding member of the neo-fascist movement and the head of one of Rome's oldest aristocratic families, he now snubs Mr. Fini. He distrusts his attempts to abandon all ideology in public.
He denied all the values which made his political fortune, and that's not correct. He can have, I think, a big success. He will have a big success now. But I think men who don't keep their own word are always dangerous.
Half a century after the end of the war, the clammy hand of history continues to have a stranglehold on the politics of this country in turmoil. Both left and right are still trying to emerge from the shadow of their past. Mr. Fini may have created a genuinely democratic party, but the only way to find out is to let him rule, and then it may be too late.
That's a report from Matt Fry. In a moment, as critics condemn some of the entries in the Orange Prize for Women's Literature as drivel, is it a prize worth winning? But before that, a brief look at some of today's other news. Stefan Serafinovich, an 85-year-old refugee from Belarus, is to face Britain's first war crimes trial. Magistrates in Dorking decided that there is sufficient evidence to commit him for trial at the Old Bailey. He faces 3 charges of murdering Jews during the Second World War. As the government published a Pathfinder prospectus for the sale of Railtrack, it was accused of trying to bribe investors into buying the shares. As well as a discount for small investors, a special dividend from last year's profits is offered. Labour will try to stop the privatisation in a Commons debate on Wednesday. The country's 9th largest building society, the Bristol & West, is to become a bank in a £600 million deal. The Bank of Ireland is to take over the society and change its status. Savers and borrowers look likely to pick up the usual windfall. The Conservative Party chairman Brian Mulwiney has told a court of how he was attacked with paint bombs after the state opening of Parliament. He was giving evidence against 4 students and a teacher who've been charged with common assault and threatening behaviour. They deny the charges. Dr. Gert Rudolf Flick has withdrawn funding of £350,000 for the Oxford University Chair in European Thought. Controversy dogged the offer, as much of Dr. Flick's fortune was inherited from his grandfather, Friedrich, an advisor to Himmler, who was jailed at Nuremberg. On the markets, the 100-share index closed at a record high of 3790, an increase of 23 points, while in New York, the Dow closed 55 points up at 55.91. The pound rose 0.3 of a pfennig against the Deutsche Mark to 2 marks 28 pfennigs, and on Wall Street, the pound fell 0.5 cent against the dollar to $1.50.7. The world of books and marketing loves nothing better than a row to ginger up interest. No Booker, NCR or Whitbread award is complete without one, and the latest, for the hitherto unknown and hugely lucrative Orange Prize has been engulfed in one before a single award has been made. Anyone can enter for the Orange, providing they're a woman. But 2 of the judges, women again, have declared that some of the books entered are drivel, an insult to the memory of the trees who died to make them possible. Opponents who think the idea of a woman-only prize is fatuous and patronising are rubbing their hands. Jane Austen did well enough in a man's world, and with the present enthusiasm for her works, you might wonder why her present-day sisters need extra help. It's not just dead women writers who've been doing well lately either. Pat Barker won the last Booker Prize. Kate Atkinson got the Whitbread.
I suppose prizes are always welcome, but I'm not absolutely sure that we need one for women. The reason that the prize started, I gather, was that a novel by Angela Carter, Wise Children, didn't make it to the Booker shortlist, but a lot of books don't make it to the Booker shortlist, including most of the novels of Martin Amis, and we don't have a prize for 40-year-old lads.
But the Orange Prize promoters say that despite the prominence of a handful of women writers, too few get onto the Booker shortlists. The 1991 Booker caused outrage by not including a single woman on its list, and since then, there's only been 1 woman a year shortlisted.
There's a need for a prize that celebrates the great range of women's writing, because women simply don't make it on the shortlist very often. Some do, but usually what happens is that you have 1 woman on a shortlist and 5 men, like last year's Booker, like the Book of the year before, like the Book of the year before. And so long as there's only 1 woman on the shortlist, she tends to get reviewed as the woman, the token woman. So, ironically, the idea of a women-only prize is actually to get books by women judged on their own merits.
Thus far, the prize hasn't covered itself in helpful headlines. Obscene, brutal, boring and dreary drivel was the way the Daily Telegraph greeted the shortlist this morning, claiming to quote 2 of the judges. But Kate Moss, novelist and chair of the panel of judges for the Orange Prize, rejects suggestions that there's been any disappointment with the quality of entries. She's surprised at the hostility the prize has met.
I naively thought we were launching a literature prize where we'd be celebrating women's achievements. You would think that I had put up a banner outside my house saying, "Kill men."
At a nearby bookshop, they were sceptical about separating male and female writers.
At the moment, the Booker Prize and such prizes, they're available for all people. I think by having a separate prize for women, you're sort of marginalising it.
And women are quite capable of winning the Booker Prize, and have done. Then on the other hand,
anything that gives women's fiction publicity has got to be a good thing.
It's a good thing to recognise that a female's perspective is somewhat different, as long as, of course, it isn't marginalised purely as female fiction and nothing else.
There is a genre of women's writing which is now very strong, very distinct, and which has strengthened during the 80s and is particularly evident at the moment. But there's also another kind of book by women writers where the gender of the author is not the important thing. And I don't think, for example, Doris Lessing or Iris Murdoch are best seen as primarily women writers, or indeed writers who are writing primarily for a female audience. Their strength is in their general humanity, not in their femaleness.
If the Orange Phone Company thinks all publicity is good publicity, they'll be pleased enough with this storm in an inkwell. Whether the cause of women's writing is advanced is another question. Well, with us now, the writer and broadcaster Sarah Ident and Miriam Gross, literary editor of the Sunday Telegraph. You could make a case, couldn't you, for saying that this has already done more harm than good?
Well, you could make a case that all publicity is good publicity, and you could also make a case, and having chaired the discussion on the book A Shortlist for many years now, that every single literary prize comes trailing clouds of controversy, because that partly fulfills exactly what a literary prize has to be.
You could make a case that the PR companies always cook it up.
Well, no, I think here, actually, the journalists have cooked it up, rather. I think it's very interesting that the article we're talking about in the Daily Telegraph was written by a journalist who talked to both of the judges for a very long time. Both of the judges said enormously positive things about the books they had chosen and how excited they are. What do we get in his article? We get a lot of the comments they made about how bad things were rather than how good things were.
Some of the books which weren't selected. Do you think this prize does anything for women's writing, Miriam Gross?
No, I don't. I mean, I think it's depressing. I wouldn't stop anyone giving or getting prizes, but I think it's depressing because it's part of the whole climate of sort of politicizing everything, where things are judged not by pure quality or merit, but by what group you represent or, you know, what gender you are, rather than whether the book is really very good. And I think literature should transcend the sort of environment in which it's written or the author's personal you know, orientation or whatever, and make it a universal experience. That's what literature is about.
But Miriam, the book prize grew out of a very specific set of circumstances, which is a huge number of women, all from the publishing industry, agents, journalists, writers, women running publishing companies, came together with a lot of evidence in front of them. You know, women in publishing had published a report saying there were very few women literary editors, fewer women reviewed fiction seriously, there were fewer women judges, that meant fewer women on the shortlist. We actually had evidence in front of us.
I mean, there are two things. Firstly, I think a lot of that is not true. I think there are many women in publishing. There are quite a lot of women literary editors, or have been. At the moment, the Independent on Sunday has a literary woman editor, and I'm one, and Claire Tomlin has been one, and many women have been literary editors. I also think that, you know, there is the possibility, I mean, as a literary editor, unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that there are more good men book reviewers than women. I don't know why this is. This is an unfortunate fact.
This is about not so much about reviewers, it's about writers. And the fact is that both the Booker and the Whitbread this year were won by women.
Well, and I'm very pleased to see it. It's taken very, very many years to reach that circumstance.
No, but I mean, people don't think in terms of male or female. I don't think Booker judges sit there thinking, now, shall we give this to a man or a woman this year? I don't think people think like that.
No, literary people but surely what one's talking about is something more subliminal. I think what's very interesting here is the kind of reaction that this prize has got. I mean, when we all sat down and thought, what should we do about it? What we didn't think is, let's whinge. What we said is, let's find a constructive method of drawing attention to this, which is celebrating women's fiction. And the kind of press this prize has got shows that men are very threatened. I have to say, I think the reason there's this much controversy is not to do with it women only. It's to do with the fact there's a lot of money on the table. And if anybody tells you that size doesn't matter, well, it does here. There's £30,000 on the table, and people are upset about that.
Of course, men are, probably some male novelists are upset that they can't put in for a prize, and that the criteria are kind of slanted. I mean, and the quality diluted by only having 50% of, you know, people who write novels being allowed to enter.
The other sort of suspicion that hangs over this prize is that there is a certain kind of writing that is produced by women, is fit only to be judged by women, and would not otherwise survive in the marketplace.
Oh, I think on the contrary, women buy and sell huge numbers of books. books which very seldom get serious attention. I mean, they're part of the major kind of popular novelists that we have in this country. I think there's an even bigger issue here, which is if every prize is discriminatory, then the one thing that this does not discriminate against is Americans. And nobody's mentioned this throughout this debate or your film. This prize allows American writers to be judged alongside British ones.
Well, why is that such a great thing?
Well, because I think that there is a subtext going on here between British and American culture. And I think the fact that the shortlist shows 4 Americans on shows that maybe one of the interesting things we should be debating is how Americans write and how British write, rather than we're talking about gender all the time. There are lots of other issues that this prize is.
But I mean, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Nigerians have won the Booker Prize.
But I would say, having looked at those Booker shortlists, and maybe Miriam would agree with me, had Americans been eligible, there would always have been at least 1 or 2 Americans on
Of course, because America is an enormous country and many, many excellent writers, both men and women. But I think it's a bit absurd just to choose American women. If you're going to open a prize to all English-speaking nations, then it would be very interesting to see who would win. But just to have women makes it a kind of rather pointless exercise, I think, because maybe 3 much better male novelists exist in America, but you won't hear about them. I mean, I don't think it's fair on people who buy books and want to get the best. You know, if 50% of potential books are excluded.
But all literary prizes set out to do is say to the buying public, there are many more interesting, fabulous books out there than you have time to see or hear about. Prizes deliberately draw attention to those things, and the Orange is doing that.
Yes, but it's also making the claim, and it's set up because they think, the founders think, that books have been, women have been discriminated against in the literary world, and I think this is just nonsense.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Thanks very much. Come back when the winners are announced. Tomorrow morning's front page is Portillo backs Israeli raids on Lebanon. The Guardian, Tories face ambush on rail cell, that ambush allegedly coming from the Ulster Unionist. Rail track in Fat Cat row over bonuses. The Financial Times, retail sales give Clark a boost. You are soft on Labour. The BBC's apparently been told by 2 advisers, according to the Daily Mail. Edward, the class system is dead. That's Prince Edward, in case you're wondering. That's all from Newsnight for tonight. I'll be back with more tomorrow night. Until then, from all of us on the programme, good night.